My mom texted, "You're banned from the wedding. Your sister wants the spotlight." I replied, "Then get off my property." I locked the gates to my estate and watched her $50,000 reception crumble. It came in at 4 minutes past 10 on a Thursday morning. I was standing at the kitchen island with my second coffee, still in the sweatshirt I sleep in, watching a crew of 4 men tighten guy lines on a pavilion that was not mine and had been paid for entirely with my money. The phone buzzed against the marble. I turned it over expecting a question about the floral delivery window because that was the kind of question I had been fielding for 11 weeks. Instead, I read it twice and then a third time, and then I set the phone down very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid of dropping. I want to be honest about what happened in my chest because I think people expect a scream. There was no scream. There was a long, flat quiet, like the second after a glass breaks in another room, when you already know what the sound was and you are only deciding how you feel about it. Out the window, the tent stood white and enormous on the south lawn, 60 by 90 feet. The poles were staked into grass I had spent 2 summers reseeding by hand because the original lawn had been half gravel and half weeds when I bought the place. Beyond it, the maples my grandmother would have recognized. Beyond those, the stone wall I had repointed myself over 3 Octobers, one section at a time, until my hands cracked open at the knuckles. I stood there in my own kitchen, in my own house, reading a message that informed me I was not welcome at an event I had funded, on property I had bled for, hosted by 2 people who had never paid $1 toward either. The coffee went cold. I did not notice for a while. I am 34. I design buildings for a living, which means I spend my days thinking about how weight travels, where it collects, and what fails first when you load a structure past what it was built to carry. I understood, standing there, that I had been reading a load-bearing report on my own family for about 15 years and refusing to sign it. I picked the phone back up. My thumb hovered. And then I did the only thing that has ever actually worked for me, which is nothing at all, for a full 90 seconds, until my hands stopped shaking. I should say what the house was, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand what it cost me. I bought it 9 years ago at auction for less than the price of a mid-size car in a metro market. 10 acres, an 1890s farmhouse with a slate roof that had failed in 2 places, a barn that leaned 11 degrees off plumb, and a black walnut tree growing straight up through the collapsed back staircase, right through the treads, reaching for a hole in the roof. The listing photos were taken at dusk, which is what you do when you are hiding water damage. Everyone told me not to. My father, who was still alive then, said I was buying a hole to pour money into. He was not wrong about the money. He was wrong about everything else. I spent the first winter living in one room with a kerosene heater and a camping stove, wearing a coat indoors, running an extension cord from a temporary pole because the service had been cut for 6 years. I learned to point stone. I learned which framing you can sister and which you have to take out entirely. I paid a roofer with money I had earmarked for a car and drove a truck with a bad transmission for another 2 years. Year 3, I got the kitchen. Year 5, I got heat that reached the 2nd floor. Year 6, the barn came off its lean and became a studio where I do my drafting, with a wall of north-facing glass I designed and installed, and still, sometimes, stand in front of like an idiot at 7 in the morning just because the light comes in a certain way. Nobody in my family lifted a single tool. Nobody offered. My mother came out twice in 9 years. The first time she walked through the framing with her arms crossed and asked when I was going to settle down. The second time she brought a candle and a gift bag and took 11 photographs. I paid the mortgage off in year 8, alone, on a Tuesday, in a title office that smelled like carpet glue. And I cried in the parking lot afterward with my hand on the roof of my truck, which is a thing I have never told anyone, including the people in this story. The deed has one name on it. It has never had any other name on it. That fact is going to matter more than I knew. Here's the arrangement I grew up inside, which I did not recognize as an arrangement until I was well into my 30s. My sister is 7 years younger. She was born early, spent her first weeks in an incubator with wires taped to her chest, and my mother has spent every year since treating that as a permanent line of credit. Whatever my sister wanted, she got, and whatever she broke, someone else swept up, usually me. When she was 9, she took my bike apart to see how it worked and left the pieces in the rain, and my mother's response was that I should be flattered she was curious. I was the other one, the steady one, the one who did not need anything, which is a thing families decide about you, and then never revisit, no matter how much evidence accumulates. The money part started when I was 24 and had my first real salary. My sister ran a credit card to its limit, buying a wardrobe or a job she did not get. The call came at 11 at night, my mother crying, saying it would ruin her credit before she even started, saying she would pay me back by spring. Nobody said the word gift. Nobody ever did. Then it was a car repair. Then it was a security deposit. Then it was my mother's mortgage. Twice. The year she quit a job she had held for 19 years because a friend convinced her to join something that was going to be enormous and folded inside 3 years. Then it was my sister's dental work. Then a phone plan she stayed on for 4 years. Then a lease she co-signed for a boyfriend and then walked away from. I have run the number since. It is a real number and I am not going to say it out loud, but it would have paid for the barn twice. The thing I need you to understand is that I was not stupid about it. I knew exactly what it was while I was doing it. I paid because every single time I paid, there were about 6 days afterward where my mother spoke to me differently, warmer, like I was someone she had chosen. 6 days is not very long, but if you have never had it, 6 days will keep you writing checks for a decade. I told myself I was being a good daughter. What I was actually doing was buying a subscription to Being Loved and letting them raise the price whenever they wanted. And I never once asked what happens when a customer like that finally cancels. My sister got engaged in February to a man who introduces himself as being in acquisitions and has never, in 3 years, been able to say what he acquires. years. He is 30. He has the specific confidence of a person who has never had to produce a document. Firm handshake, good jacket, remembers your coffee order. He also had 2 ventures that closed, a car in his mother's name, and a habit of picking up the check with a flourish and then quietly asking my sister for the money later. I know that last part because she told me laughing, like it was a charming quirk. The ring was substantial and financed. My mother wept. The wedding they described was not a wedding, it was a production. 200 guests, imported peonies, a string quartet for the ceremony, and a 9-piece band for the reception, a photographer flown in, custom signage, welcome bags with printed maps, a tent big enough to seat the whole guest list under crystal because an indoor venue would not photograph correctly. The number they landed on was $50,000. Between the two of them, at that moment, they had roughly $1,100 and a credit score that would not have gotten them a store card. The dinner where it happened was at my mother's condo in March. Roast, chicken, the good plates, everyone being unusually pleasant to me, which should have been the first alarm. My sister described the tent. My mother described the light on my south lawn in September in detail, like a person who had already walked it and taken measurements. Then she looked at me across the table with the face she saves for this, which is not a demand, it is an opportunity being offered to me. And she said, it would just be such a shame for that beautiful property to sit there empty on a day like that. I want to tell you I saw the trap. I did not. What I felt, sitting there, was something closer to being chosen, and I have thought about that a great deal since. So I offered the whole thing. The venue, free, the landscaping, the tent rental, the catering deposit, the lighting. I said it in one breath before anyone could ask, because I wanted to be the one who gave it rather than the one who was asked. My sister screamed and knocked over a water glass. Her fiancé shook my hand with both of his. My mother came around the table and held my face and told me I had no idea what this meant to her. And for 6 days afterward, she called me every night, and I felt like I had finally paid enough. The 11 weeks that followed taught me more about my family than the previous 30 years combined, and I still managed to learn none of it in time. My sister took the house the way a new manager takes over a store. Within 9 days, she had a key, which I gave her, and a code to the front gate, which I also gave her, and a folder on her phone labeled with the property name that she showed to people at parties. She wanted the front doors repainted. They are original mahogany, refinished by a man in his 70s who worked on them in his own shop for 5 weeks, and she wanted them painted a chalky off-white because the wood clashed with her color story. When I said no, she called me rigid. She walked a photographer through my rose beds and heels twice and left divots I filled with a trowel on my knees the next morning. She had a crew stack 40 folding chairs against the barn's south glass. She scheduled a rehearsal for a Saturday I had told her twice I would be out of state, then called me furious that the gate code had not been shared with her florist. The exchange I keep coming back to happened in June. I asked her politely to keep the vendor trucks off the east lawn because the septic field runs under it and the ground was soft after rain. She did not even look up from her phone. It's my day, she said. Don't make it about your house rules. My mother was standing right there. She has a way of arriving at exactly the moment when a boundary is being set, like she can hear it through walls. Don't stress the bride, she said. That was the whole conversation. That was every conversation for 11 weeks, in different clothes. And her fiancé would wander. That is the word for it. He wandered through my house with a glass of my wine, opening doors, standing in rooms he had no reason to be in. I came around a corner one evening and found him in my studio at my drafting table, going through a flat file of drawings. He did not apologize or startle. He said the barn had good bones and asked what I thought the whole property would go for in a strong market. I told him I had no idea because I was never selling. He smiled at me and said, everybody sells. I thought he was being crass. I filed it under crass. That was a mistake. And it was not the only one I made that summer, but it is the one I would take back first. My cousin is the one who tried. She does books for a small chain of hardware stores. She has a face that gives away exactly nothing, and she has never once in her life been fooled by my mother, which has cost her about 15 years of invitations. She cornered me at the dress fitting in July, in the hallway outside the changing rooms, while my sister was up on the platform being pinned. They're using you, she said. You know that, right? I gave her the line I had been giving myself, that it was a gift, that I could afford it, that it was one day out of my life, and it would buy me a decade of peace. She let me finish. Then she said something I did not understand for another 2 months. She said, it isn't the money I'd be watching. I asked her what that meant. She started to answer, and then my mother appeared around the corner with a garment bag, and my cousin's face closed like a drawer sliding shut, and she said she needed to take a call. There was another thing that summer that I logged and dismissed. In May, on a weekday, I came back from a site visit, and there was a car in my driveway I did not recognize, and a man in a windbreaker walking the south side of the house with a clipboard photographing the elevation. My sister was on the porch with her arms crossed against the cold. I asked who he was. She said without a pause that he was with the tent company doing a site survey for the ground anchors. He waved at me. He was pleasant. He photographed the barn, the tree line, and the front elevation, and he asked me, in passing, how old the slate was. I told him the roof was 3 years old. He wrote it down. I remember thinking that the tent people were unusually thorough, and then I went inside and made dinner and did not think about it again for 11 weeks. There is a version of me that walks over and asks that man for a card. I have spent a lot of time with her. By the last week of August, the whole thing was built. The pavilion went up on a Tuesday, 60 by 90, with a dance floor deck leveled over the slope on the south side. The lighting crew ran cable through the maples. The rental company delivered 200 chairs, 31 tables, and a bar. A generator sat behind the barn under a sound blanket. The florist had confirmed a delivery window for Friday, and there were $4,000 of imported peonies coming from a wholesaler 2 states away. Every one of those contracts was signed by me. I want to be precise about this because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. Not one of those vendors would take my sister or her fiancé as the responsible party. The catering company ran a credit check and declined them in under an hour. The rental company required a personal guarantee on a deposit that size. The lighting outfit wanted a card on file with a limit that neither of them possessed, so I signed. Every contract, every guarantee, every deposit, my name on the client line and my card on file, because I was the only adult in the arrangement with a credit history, and because at the time, it felt like one more small thing to absorb. They knew this. They had watched me do it. They simply never once thought about what it meant, because it had never occurred to either of them that a person who always pays might also be a person who can stop. That Thursday morning, I was watching the crew tension the guy lines and thinking, in a quiet, satisfied way, that it was going to be beautiful. That my mother was going to stand under that tent and look around and know that I had done it. That was the whole prize. That was what $50,000 was buying me. The phone buzzed at 4 minutes past 10. She told me I was permanently banned from the wedding. She told me my sister wanted the spotlight to herself and that my presence would ruin the aesthetic she had worked so hard on. She told me to leave the gate keys and the access codes with my sister's fiancé by Friday and not to make a scene about it. She signed off with the phrase she has used my entire life when she wants a conversation to be over before it starts. She wrote that she hoped I could be mature about this. I read it 3 times. I put the phone face down on the marble. And then something in me went very still and very clear, the way it does about 90 seconds into a structural failure, when you stop being surprised and start being useful. I typed 5 words. I did not draft them. I did not soften them. I did not read them back. Then get off my property. Send. Phone face down. I walked to the security panel in the mudroom, entered my administrator code, and wiped every gate credential in the system. My sister's, her fiancé's, my mother's, which she had never used but had asked for twice, the temporary vendor codes, all of it, gone, replaced with a single new sequence that existed nowhere but in my own head. Then I sat down at the counter with my laptop and the folder where I keep contracts, and I started making calls, and this is the part I think about when I cannot sleep because of how calm I was. The catering company first. I told the events manager that the host party was in material breach and that I was terminating service. She asked me to confirm I understood the deposit was non-refundable at 9 days out. I said I did. $11,000 gone in the time it takes to say a sentence, and I felt nothing except a kind of clean, cold relief. The rental company second. I told them I needed the pavilion, the deck, the chairs, the tables, and the bar off my property by sunset. The scheduler said that was not standard. I said I would pay the emergency dismantle fee and asked what it was. He told me. I gave him my card number from memory. The lighting crew was already on site. I walked out and told the foreman personally. He was decent about it. He asked if everything was all right, and I said no. And he nodded once and started coiling cable without another word, which was the kindest thing anyone did for me that day. The florist last. $4,000 of peonies already cut and on a truck. I called and asked whether they could be redirected. They could. I gave her the address of a women's shelter downtown and asked that no card go with them. By 2 in the afternoon, there were 3 trucks in my drive. By 5, the deck came apart in sections. By 6:30, the pavilion came down in one long white collapse, like a lung emptying, and 4 men folded it into a shape the size of a car. At 7 o'clock, I walked the south lawn in bare feet. There were stake holes every 8 feet and a rectangle of flattened grass 60 by 90, and otherwise it was just a field again, going gold, with the maples going dark behind it. I went down to the gate at the road and ran a chain through the bars, and I put a padlock on it, and I stood there for a while in the last of the light with one palm flat against the iron. I thought that was the end of it. That is the sentence I would put on the whole first half of this. No venue, no caterer, no tent, no flowers, no lights, and a padlock at the bottom of the drive. 9 days out. I had ended a $50,000 event in about 4 hours using nothing but the phone numbers of people I had already paid, and I remember sitting on the terrace that night with a glass of wine thinking that I had won, and being surprised by how little it tasted like anything. They found out the next morning. A rented SUV came up the road at 20 past 8 and stopped at the gate, and I watched the whole thing from the terrace with binoculars I keep for the hawks. Her fiancé got out in a track jacket. He walked to the keypad and entered the code. Nothing. He entered it again, slower, the way people do when they believe the machine is the problem. Nothing. He put both hands on the bars and shook them, which does not do anything to a gate that is chained, and then he kicked the lower rail twice and stood back with his hands on his head. Then he started shouting. I could not make out words at that distance, only the shape of them, and the shape of them was not a man asking to be let in. It was a man who had been told something was his and had just found out otherwise. He was there for 40 minutes. He called someone. He walked the fence line east for about 200 feet, looking, which is the detail that decided me, and I went inside and called the county. 2 deputies came. I walked down the gravel in a cardigan with the original deed in a plastic sleeve and my license in my hand, because I had been raised by a woman who could make anyone doubt anything, and I was not going to arrive at that gate with only my word. He was already talking when I got there. He told them there was a wedding on this property in 9 days. He told them his fiance's family owned it. He told them I was the sister and that I was having an episode. The senior deputy looked at the deed for a long moment. Then he looked at the license. Then he handed both back to me and turned around. Sir, he said, this is her house. They walked him back to the SUV. My neighbor was out at her mailbox with a dog and a coffee, watching all of it. And I remember thinking, with a small, ugly satisfaction I am not proud of, that by lunch the entire road would know. My phone did not stop for 2 days. 9 voicemails from my mother in the first first 11 hours. I have listened to all of them since, which I would not recommend. The first 3 are cold and instructive. A woman explaining a misunderstanding to a slow child. The 4th is negotiation. The 6th is where it turns, and she calls me jealous and says the word barren, which she has never said to my face in 34 years and clearly had loaded and ready. The 9th is quiet. In the 9th, she says, "You've made your point. Open the gate." 26 texts. 4 from my sister, one of which was a paragraph about how I had always resented her for being born and had finally found a way to make her pay for it. Then a video posted publicly, 41 seconds, filmed in a car with good light, in which she cried about a toxic family member who had sabotaged her dream out of pure spite 9 days before her wedding. The comments were what you would expect. Several hundred strangers who had never met me deciding what I was. Then the extended family started. An aunt who has not called me since my father's funeral called me twice. An uncle sent a long message about forgiveness and about how our parents will not be here forever. 2 second cousins unfriended me, which I only noticed later. Somebody set up a fundraiser to save the wedding and it made $150 in 4 days and then quietly disappeared. Nobody asked me what happened. Not one person. That is the part that stayed. 40-some people had opinions and not a single one of them opened with a question. I did not answer any of it. I worked. I had a mixed-use project in schematic design with a deadline, and I sat in the barn with the north glass in front of me and drew, and it was the only 9 hours of that week that felt like being a person. On the 3rd night, I went back out to the south lawn. The grass was already starting to come back where the deck had been. In 2 weeks, you would not be able to tell anything had ever stood there. I stood in the middle of that rectangle in the dark, and I waited to feel the thing I had been promised my whole life, which is that when you finally stop letting people take from you, something warm arrives to replace it. Nothing arrived. It was grass, and it was mine, and I was extremely tired. I want to be clear that at that point, I still believed this was a story about a wedding. The tent contractor called me on the following Tuesday. I almost let it go to voicemail. I assumed it was about the emergency dismantle fee, or a stake that had gone missing, or damage to the deck sections. I picked up standing in the driveway with my keys in my hand. He was polite about it. That is what I remember most, that he was so careful with me, and I could not work out why for the first 30 seconds. He said he needed a signature from the property owner on the removal form for his file, because the site release he had on record had been signed by someone else, and his office had flagged it during reconciliation. He apologized for the confusion. He said he wanted to explain how the confusion had happened, because he did not want me to think his company had been careless. Then he told me that the woman who booked the job in April had told him she was the owner. I said, "What woman?" He described her. He described her exactly, down to the ring she wears on her right hand and the way she says the property name, which is not the address. It is a name my mother started using at some point that I had assumed was a joke. He said she had walked him around the grounds in the spring. He said she had taken him along the south side and pointed out where the poles could go and told him the anchors would be fine because the ground was solid there. She knew the property well. He said she called it her place. Twice, he said. Her place. I asked him what she had said about me. He was quiet for a second. Then he said that when he had asked about the woman who lived in the main house, she told him I managed the property for her. I sat down. Not on anything. I sat down on the gravel in my own driveway with my keys still in my hand and my back against the front wheel of my truck. And I said thank you. And I asked him to send me everything in his file and I hung up. I want to describe the feeling accurately because it was not rage. Rage came later and it was almost a relief. What came first was a kind of vertigo. The sensation you get when a step is not where your foot expected it. Because I had just been told that a room I had been standing in for 9 years had a different shape than I thought. I spent that night with every document I had, and I did it the way I do a structural review, which is slowly, in order, writing down what is actually on the page rather than what I expect to be there. The catering contract came first. My name on the guarantor line, my card on file, my signature at the bottom, and on the client line, above all of it, in the field that says who the event belongs to, somebody had written my mother's name and a phone number that was hers. I had signed that page in April without reading the field above my own. I had signed it in a parking lot on my phone, between meetings, because they needed it back that afternoon. The rental agreement had the same structure. Responsible party, me. Site, contact, and client, her. Then the insurance. Events that size require a certificate of liability, and I remembered approving the cost and never once looking at the document. I pulled it up. The certificate named the venue as the property, listed the address correctly, and identified the insured party as my mother, described on the form as the property owner. That is a signed representation to an insurance carrier. I read that line about 9 times. Then I went and found an invitation. I had never held one. They had been mailed in June to 200 addresses, and nobody had sent me one, which at the time I had explained away as an oversight because I was already going to be there. My cousin photographed hers and sent it to me at 11 at night. Heavy stock, letterpress, very tasteful. And under the date where the venue goes, it did not say the address. It did not say the name of the house. It said the ceremony and reception would be held at the family estate. The family estate. 4 words, no street, no town, no clarification, as though it were a thing we had all inherited together and everyone receiving that card already knew which one. I sat with that for a long time, because if you are one of the 200 people holding that card and you have been hearing about it for a year, you do not arrive on that lawn thinking you are a guest in my house. You arrive thinking you are a guest in hers. I called my cousin the next morning at 6, which tells you where I was. She picked up on the second ring. I asked her what she had meant in the hallway at the fitting when she said the money was not the part she would be watching. She was quiet long enough that I said her name. Then she said, "I thought you knew. I genuinely thought you knew and had decided decided to let it go. For about a year, she said, at every gathering I did not attend, my mother had been talking about the property, not my property, the property. Then, by winter, her property in the valley. She described the restoration in the first person. She talked about the winter with the kerosene heater as a hardship she had endured. She told an aunt she had chosen the slate herself. At a christening in February, she had shown people photographs on her phone. My photographs, the ones I post twice a year, and she had scrolled through them for a table of 11 people describing what each room had cost her. I asked why nobody had ever said anything to me. My cousin said the thing that has taken me the longest to make peace with. She said, because you were never there. She only ever tells it at the things you don't come to, which was true. I had stopped going to the christenings and the birthdays and the Sunday things years earlier because they exhausted me and because I always left them feeling like a coat somebody had forgotten. And in the space where I was not, a version of me had been built and distributed, and that version was a woman with a good job who looked after her mother's country house. I asked my cousin why she had never corrected it. She said she had, twice, and that both times my mother had laughed and said that, of course it was in my name for tax reasons because I am the one with the income, and that everyone had nodded because that is a sentence that sounds like an explanation. Tax reasons. She had been saying that for a year to 100 people, and every single one of them had accepted it, and why would they not? Once you know a thing, everything you already had rearranges itself around it. That is the disorienting part. I did not learn very much new after that morning. I just went back through 9 years and read it correctly. The man with the clipboard in May. I had not thought about him in months. I sat at the drafting table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and made myself remember the whole thing. And here is what I actually saw when I stopped believing my sister's answer. He photographed the front elevation, the barn, the tree line, and the roof. He asked me the age of the slate. He wrote it in a notebook. A tent company measuring for ground anchors does not photograph a roof line. A tent company does not care how old your slate is. A tent company cares about grade, drainage, access width, and overhead clearance. And this man had not looked at any of those things. I drove to my neighbor's on Thursday, the one with the dog, who has been on that road for 30 years and misses nothing. She made me tea, and she told me, without my having to ask twice, that back in the spring, a woman had been out at the property several times when I was not home, that she had assumed it was fine, that once there had been a second car and 2 people walking the boundary at the tree line, and that the woman had waved at her and called across the road in a friendly way that she was getting the place valued. My neighbor said she had assumed I was thinking about selling and had felt a little sad about it. I went home and opened the drawer in the kitchen where I put mail I never read. It is a real drawer and it goes back years. Takeout menus, expired coupons, a church newsletter. There was a card in there from a real estate agent, one of the ones who farm a zip code and send you a magnet in the spring. Handwritten on the back, in the loose blue script they teach them, it said it had been a pleasure meeting at the property and to please reach out with any questions about the comparative analysis. It was dated the 12th of May. It was addressed to nobody. It had been left, not mailed, because there was no stamp and no postmark, and I had scooped it off the console table into the drawer without a glance, the way I do with every piece of paper that looks like an advertisement. My mother called on the Saturday, first time in 9 days, and she used a number I did not recognize, which is how she got me to pick up. She did not apologize. I want to be careful here, because I have replayed this call enough times to have stopped embellishing it, and the truth is, she never said one word that was a lie in the way people mean when they say lie. She said she had heard I was upset about some paperwork. I asked her whether she had told a tent contractor she owned my house. There was a pause, and then she said, in a tone of mild correction, the way she used to tell me my sweater was on inside out, that it was easier to explain it that way to people who did not need the details. I asked her about the invitations, the family estate. She said, well, what would you have me put? Your address? Like the alternative was tacky. Like I was the one making it uncomfortable. I asked her about the certificate of liability and the appraiser in May and the agent's card in my drawer, and I got through about half of it before she interrupted me and said the sentence I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, nothing you have is only yours. Not angry, not defensive. She said it the way you would explain a rule to someone who had somehow reached 34 without learning it. She genuinely believed it. That was the part I could not get around all weekend. She was not embarrassed at being caught because in her version of events there was nothing to catch. In her version, a daughter who does well is a resource the family has generated, and a house is a family asset that happens to be sitting under one person's name, and I had simply become confused about my role. Then she said she assumed I would come to my senses before the deposit deadlines, and she hung up. I did not sleep much that night, and I still did not know what the keys were for. On Friday, I emailed the day of coordinator. She was the one vendor I had never met, hired in July, paid by me, a woman who ran weddings for a living and had no idea she was standing in the middle of anything. My email was 4 lines. I identified myself as the contracted payer, I said the event had been canceled, and I asked her to send me the complete production file for reconciliation before I disputed anything with my card issuer. The word reconciliation does a lot of work with vendors. It arrived in 90 minutes. It was 41 pages. Floor plan, seating chart, vendor contact sheet, delivery windows, a rain plan, a shot list for the photographer, a music cue sheet, a parking diagram with a note about the septic field on the east lawn that somebody had finally written down. I read all of it because by then I had stopped assuming I knew what any document said. The seating chart had 204 names on it. Mine was not one of them. That did not surprise me anymore, but there was something worse, which was that there was no gap. There was no removed name, no hole in a table, no evidence of a decision made recently. recently and in anger. The chart had been built in July at 204 and it had never had me in it. Whatever had happened on Thursday morning at 4 minutes past 10 had been decided long before Thursday morning. The shot list had a line I read twice. Under the reception section, between the cake and the parent dances, somebody had typed a request for a wide shot of the couple, with the mother of the bride on the front steps of the main house, with the doors open behind them. The doors she had wanted painted. I understood that I was reading a plan, but I did not yet understand what the plan was for. That came 4 pages later, in the run of show, which is the minute-by-minute timeline a coordinator builds so that 100 moving pieces land in the right order. I read the reception column with my finger on the screen the way you read a schedule when you are looking for your own name. Page 19, reception timeline. Between the cake cutting at 8:25 and the first parent dance at 8:50, there was one line, 8:40 in the evening. Mother of the bride, remarks and keys presentation. I read it 4 times before it went in. Keys presentation. A gift. On a lawn I had reseated by hand, under lights I had paid for, in front of 204 people who had spent a year being told that this was her property and that her older daughter held the title for tax reasons. That is what the wedding was, and what it had been the entire time. Not a ceremony, an announcement. The 11 weeks, the peonies, the quartet, the photographer flown in, the shot of the couple on the front steps with the doors open behind them, all of it was staging for 90 seconds at 8:40 in the evening, in which my mother would hand my sister a set of keys to my house while 200 people applauded and a camera documented it, and it would become permanently the thing everyone knew had happened. And I finally understood the ban, because there were only 2 ways that moment could go with me standing in that tent. Either I let it happen and said nothing in front of every relative I have, and my silence became the record, or I stood up in the middle of my sister's wedding reception and told 200 people that my mother was giving away a house she did not own, and spent the rest of my life as the woman who ruined a wedding out of jealousy, exactly as the story about me had already been built to predict. There was no third door. That is not an accident. That is design, and I know design when I am looking at it. They did not ban me over an aesthetic. They banned me because I am the only living person who could stand up at 8:40 in the evening and say no, and they could not risk having me in the room. The text at 4 minutes past 10 was not an insult. It was the last load-bearing piece of the plan, and she sent it herself in writing from her own phone. I called an attorney on Monday, not to sue anyone. I wanted a professional to look at the certificate of liability with my mother listed as owner and tell me whether I was overreacting. He read everything I sent, then called and asked in a very level voice whether my mother had ever had a key made, ever received mail at the address, or ever stayed overnight. I said she had visited twice in 9 years. He said, "Good, keep it that way." Then he explained gently that paper like this does not take a house from anybody, but that it is the kind of thing built slowly by people counting on the fact that nobody in a family ever asks to see the file. Then I did the one thing I have ever done that I would call cruel, and I would do it again without hesitating. I had the guest list. I had it because I had paid for the invitations, and the coordinator had every address in the production file. I wrote one email. 6 sentences, no adjectives, nothing about my sister, and nothing about my childhood. I wrote that I am the sole owner of the property, that I had offered it and funded the event as a gift, that I had been formally banned from attending by the 2 people hosting it, and that I had therefore withdrawn both the venue and the funding. I attached 3 things: a scan of the deed, the certificate of liability with the owner line visible, and page 19 of the run of show with 1 line on it. I did not attach the text message. I did not need to. I put it in the body, in plain type, exactly as she had written it, and I let 204 people read my mother's own words at the bottom of a document that explained what those words had been for. I sent it at 9 in the morning, which is when people check their email, then put the phone in a drawer and drew for 4 hours. There were 61 replies by the time I came back in. My cousin had hit reply all inside of 11 minutes, which is the single greatest act of loyalty anyone has performed for me, and she had written 4 words. She wrote, "I tried to tell you." The aunt who had called me twice about forgiveness wrote to say she had been shown photographs of that house at a christening in February, along with a story about Slate. She used the word humiliated about herself. An uncle asked, in a thread I was not on and was forwarded anyway, one very simple question: who had actually paid for the tent? The wedding still happened. It did not vanish. It simply became what it always would have been without me. They moved it to a public park on the north side of town, the shelter you reserve for $60, beside a playground and a parking lot. My cousin went. 51 people came out of 204. Folding tables from a church basement, deli trays, a sheet cake, somebody's phone, and a plastic cup for music. She sent me 2 photographs. In one, my sister is standing in the grass in an enormous beaded gown, holding the hem up out of the dirt with both hands. In the other, my mother is sitting alone at the end of a folding table with her purse in her lap, not looking at anything. There was no keys presentation. There was nothing at 8:40 in the evening at all. The rest is paperwork, and I did all of it inside 3 weeks. I had the attorney draft a letter to the insurance carrier correcting the record on the certificate. I had a second letter sent to my mother and my sister, formally notifying them that they had no interest of any kind in the property, no license to enter it, and no authority to represent themselves to any third party as connected to it. I updated my will. I put the deed in a trust with a corporate trustee and a single beneficiary who is not related to me by blood. The gate has a new code. 4 people have it, and none of them share my last name. My mother sent one more message 6 weeks later, at 2 in the morning, the hour at which she has always done her best work. She wrote that I had humiliated her in front of every person she knows. I did not answer it. I sent her page 19.